Hello, my pretty listeners. It's the weekend before Halloween, and I have another spooky-themed episode for you. Today, we're going back to the 1600s to explore colonial New York and the impact they had on the witch trial hysteria that was spreading through the neighboring colonies of Massachusetts and Connecticut. Hold on to your brooms, everybody. I'm Amanda, and you're listening to New York's Dark Side. What's up, everyone? How's it going with the veil being so thin? The other day, my husband and I had a little bit of an experience. We were in the kitchen of our house at the bar where I record the video for this show, and I noticed a very sudden, strong citrus flower perfume type smell, and I thought I was going crazy, which honestly wouldn't be that surprising. But then Jared also picked up the smell, and it came as suddenly as it went, but I started walking towards the kitchen sink and picked it up again, almost like it was kind of wandering away from us. I think we were visited. I'm not sure by who. My husband probably is a bit more skeptical, but I'm going to go with my version. Whoever it was seemed very lovely, and I really liked the smell of their perfume. So if you're still around, my friend, feel free to come back. Just a couple quick notes before we get to the content. I've been working on going back and updating the first couple of episodes for just some better audio quality. I just did that with the Willowbrook episode, and since I've been fortunate enough to upgrade some of the equipment, and I've learned a lot about editing the audio now that we're, 17 episodes in, I just wanted to mention that in case anyone went back and realized it sounds different, but in a good way. The content is all the same, but the audio quality is much better. My other announcement is that I've launched on Patreon, so please feel free to join me over there. I'll link it in the show notes for the episode and put it on our social medias. I've just got the one tier for right now. In exchange for any generous donations in support of the show, you'll get exclusive access to the fan community, posts from me with sneak peeks of upcoming episodes, and some more fan club only content. So thanks for considering joining and supporting the show. Your donations will go towards the website maintenance, continuing to upgrade hardware, software, and just towards research materials. So anything to support the show. Okay, enough business. For today's episode, we're talking about colonial New York's role in the Massachusetts and Connecticut witch trials. Honestly, I really kind of dove into the stories of the accused here. So New York's part might seem fairly small, but I think it's just appropriate. So I am very excited for this coverage. I've honestly been looking forward to it since I started the podcast. I feel like this theme is honestly going to kind of tie in nicely to what I have planned for November, because today we're going to touch on some dirty politicians, and we're going into the November voting season, so it just seems appropriate. When I first started looking into witch trials in New York State, I wasn't sure what to expect, to be honest. I knew a bit about the Salem Witch Trials, but hadn't heard anything about them occurring in New York State. So I was surprised and honestly glad to find that at least in the late 1600s, New York was actually a haven for some of the refugees from other colonies who were fleeing from their accusers. Some of my best bitches are witches. Like, seriously. They even have a shop called Witchy and Bitchy Conjurations that you can find either locally if you're listening from the southern tier region of New York at the shops of 607 in Johnson City, or online through their Etsy shop. Both will be linked in the show notes, and I'll share out on social medias. Love to Jess and Nicole. We're going to start with the tale of Philip and Mary English. Philip came to Salem, Massachusetts in 1670 after immigrating from the Isle of Jersey at the age of 19. It was there that he met and later married Mary Hollingsworth, who was the daughter of wealthy merchants named William and Eleanor Hollingsworth. It's important to note here that in the 1600s, it was a very different time where women were expected to be subordinate to men. Eleanor Hollingsworth, Mary's mother, actually had been a property owner. She owned a boarding house and pub named the Blue Anchor Tavern, which she ran independently while her husband William was away at sea. The business was good and it made a good profit, helping to grow the family's wealth. This placed Eleanor and then later Mary in positions of power, which made the other colonists extremely uneasy. When William Hollingsworth was lost at sea, Eleanor was made his power of attorney and was able to pay off his debts and owned the Blue Anchor Tavern outright, which was very unusual for the times. Eleanor was said to be a very strong and aggressive woman. At one point, a neighbor, Goodwife Dicer, accused Eleanor of being a, quote, black-mouthed whore and a black-mouthed witch. Eleanor responded by taking Goody Dicer to court, and Goody Dicer was ordered to pay a fine for slandering Eleanor's name. According to one source, Eleanor is also rumored to be one of the possible models for Hester Prynne, the lead character of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Eleanor was accused of witchcraft in 1685 and in 1689 would die before her name was cleared. Mary Hollingsworth English would inherit the Blue Anchor Tavern along with the wharf, a prosperous estate, brewing equipment, a dictionary, needlepoint chairs, and an unnamed Indian servant who was valued at 25 pounds. Mary Hollingsworth and Philip English married in 1675. Their descendants would say that Philip had a deep respect for Mary's strong head for business. They built their lives in a beautiful home with a view of the harbor on Essex Street in Salem, where they would raise their 2 daughters. Philip developed an extremely profitable trading company consisting of 21 ships, 14 lots, and a wharf. He grew to be in the top 1% of wealth in Salem by trading fish for produce from the tropics and goods from Europe. And while it sounds like the American dream being realized, the rising political tensions of the time were about to bring things crashing down for Philip and Mary. In 1689, the colonies of North America got involved in an extension of the War of the Great Alliance being waged by King William III of Great Britain against France under King Louis XIV. The colonies of New England and Canada were divided in their support to their mother countries and with their allies with the Native Americans, which sparked the King William's War, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Second Indian War. Well, I'm not going to go down the whole rabbit hole of talking about the details of the war. It's important to bring up because the tensions of the war were the driving force for the outcomes of this story. Philip English was a French immigrant. As I mentioned earlier, he was born on the Isle of Jersey to French Huguenot parents, but he was now living among the English colonists, and this likely led to some of the resentments that fueled the accusations. On March 8, 1692, Philip English was elected to a Salem town selectman position, defeating a rival colonist for the position. Philip English, while prospering greatly in his business, had a reputation within the colony due to having a flair for tax evasion and for being quick to file suit against anyone that owed him a debt. It's likely that a combination of the rising political tensions between the French and English colonists, along with the resentments that Philip had been building between himself and his neighbors, led to the accusations against both Philip and Mary. Just before midnight on April 18, 1692, a warrant was filed for Mary English on the charge of witchcraft. Sheriff George Corwin and his deputies came to the home of Philip and Mary, entered Mary's bedroom, and ordered her to come with them. Mary, however, was not having it, and instructed the sheriff to go the fuck away and come back for her in the morning, and went back to sleep. I don't know if she actually said fuck, but that's what I would have said. Badass Mary English taking after her mom. Sheriff Corwin complied, and he had his deputies guard the house to make sure that she didn't escape, and he left. Mary got up the following morning, she got herself around, she ate some breakfast, and then she allowed them to take her to a room at the Cat and Wheel Tavern near the Salem Meeting House. 2 days later, on April 20th, a warrant was issued for Philip English on the charge of witchcraft after Thomas Putnam and Captain John Walcott made accusations against him. Philip was aware that this accusation might be coming, and he actually hid in a secret room of the house before fleeing to Boston. On April 22nd, Mary English would appear at the Salem Meeting House before a large crowd to address the accusations against her. A colonist named Susanna Sheldon, who was one of the core witchcraft accusers in Salem, would claim that she had seen Mary's apparition before her and that Mary had been accompanied by a black man sporting a tall hat. Another colonist, Abigail Williams, would also report that she had seen the specter of George Jacobs, and he told her that he had recruited Mary as a witch. This would ensure that Mary remained imprisoned. She stayed at the tavern for a few more weeks before being transferred to a Boston jail on May 12, 1692, to await trial. Susanna Sheldon would also lay accusations against Philip English on April 24th, stating that he, quote, stepped over his pew and pinched her, end quote, afflicting her, quote, in a very sad manner, end quote. The balls of Philip English, my God. A second warrant would end up being issued for Philip's arrest on the accusation of witchcraft on May 6, 1692. This time, officers would search the house of one of his friends, George Hollard. Philip was actually in the house, but they didn't find him because he hid under a pile of dirty laundry. I'm just wondering, how big of a pile of dirty laundry did they have? But again, they washed everything by hand and had to dry it out on a line. It's probably not the easiest thing to do. I'm feeling pretty grateful for my washer and dryer right now, even though my dryer is acting like a jerk. Anyway, you don't want to hear about my dryer. On May 17th, Susanna Sheldon would again report to authorities that Philip came to her with a black man and a woman with his devil's book and tried to force her to sign it, telling her that if she didn't, he would cut her throat. She had also been visited by a specter that told her that Philip had murdered him and drowned him in the sea, and that Philip knew that the specter had come to her and told her not to tell anyone of the murder or he would cut her legs off, kill the governor, and 10 folks in Boston over the next 6 days. Philip became concerned that his continued escape was actually hurting Mary's case, so he ended up returning to Salem on May 30th and turned himself in. He would be questioned the next day by Judge Jonathan Corwin, and he was sent to the Boston jail due to overcrowding of the Salem jail with all the witch trials stuff. And the Boston jail actually allowed them to bail out for the day as long as they promised to return at night. And due to their wealth, Philip and Mary would do this often. Another witness would come forward against Philip English on August 8th, 1692, and his name was William Beale. Beale and Philip had a history because Philip had actually filed a lawsuit against him back in 1690 over 2 tracts of land. Beale would report that Philip had come to him and offered him a bribe to provide favorable testimony of him in the witchcraft case. When he was speaking with a friend about the lawsuit, his nose began gushing blood in an extraordinary amount, and he believed this was due to Philip's witchcraft. He would also claim to see a shadowy figure, and after this, he learned that his son James was sick with smallpox, and James would unfortunately die shortly after this. His other son, George, had died a few months earlier in the same house due to smallpox, and had complained of feeling like he was being constantly choked. And it's really sad that a lot of things that we know now are natural things, like getting smallpox at the time. It was highly infectious. It had nothing to do with witchcraft, but they didn't have a lot to do during the time, so they would blame each other for things. So Philip and Mary English were due to return to Salem on August 21st, 1692 to face trial. However, a Boston minister, Joshua Mooley, convinced them to flee. He based his service that Sunday on a passage from Matthew 10:23, stating, quote, "If they persecute you in one city, flee to another," end quote. He would later visit them in jail that evening, telling them that he had arranged for them to slip out of the colony. Philip and Mary were slightly reluctant to leave as they had 2 teenage daughters, but they took the minister's advice and left Boston by carriage to New York. Their daughters would remain in Boston, staying with friends. Philip and Mary received updates regarding the witchcraft hysteria And Philip would even arrange for shiploads of food to be sent to Salem to help with the food scarcity. Salem ended up encountering this due to drought, but they were also losing a lot of time tending to the crops in the fields because of everything going on with the witch trials. Another couple would also flee Salem to New York, and they were Elizabeth and Nathaniel Cary. They had married in July of 1684. I keep wanting to say 1984 and 1962 and anyway, they had married in July of 1684 and settled in Charlestown, where they built their family. Elizabeth would be accused of witchcraft by some of the same players we've already met, Thomas Putnam and another man named Benjamin Hutchinson, claiming that Elizabeth had afflicted Mary Walcott, Abigail Williams, and Mercy Lewis with her witchcraft. The accusations came in on May 28, 1692. On May 29th, she was examined, and they completed what they called the touch test on her. And this is just fucking bizarre. The idea behind the touch test is that a witch afflicts somebody by coming in contact with them. These afflicted girls had at some point been in contact with Elizabeth Cary, and the touch test detailed that she needed to touch them to see if it cured their sudden affliction. So they were having fits, falling into fits where they were carrying on, contorting themselves, screaming, going into stupors, like that type of thing. So they were at the proceeding and they were having their fits and carrying on and doing whatever. And she touched them and nothing changed. They continued to have a fit. So this marked her as guilty. If they had been cured of their ailments and stopped crying, stopped carrying on, stopped fainting, or whatever the hell they were doing, she would have been found innocent. So Elizabeth was sent to Boston jail. The following day, Nathaniel Cary would end up being accused of witchcraft, but nothing came of that accusation. Nathaniel was able to successfully get Elizabeth moved from Boston to the jail in Cambridge, which was closer to their home. He tried to get her moved to their own district, knowing that she would not get a fair trial in Salem because he knew what was up, but he wasn't able to do that. Running out of options, he ended up breaking her out of Cambridge prison, and they fled to Rhode Island and then later to New York. During this time, Massachusetts wasn't the only colony dealing with witchcraft hysteria. So was Connecticut. At the end of April 1692, the servant of Daniel and Abigail Westcott of Stamford, Connecticut, began to have fits. Catherine Branch, or Kate as she was also known, was a 17-year-old orphan who had come to live with the Westcotts as their servant. Daniel was a prominent figure in the colony. He had recently been elected to his second term as one of Stamford's representatives to the Colonial Assembly, and he was also a sergeant in the town militia. This gave the Westcotts a higher status than many of their neighbors in the town and allowed them to go by Mr. and Mistress rather than Goodman and Goodwife. On the first day that Kate was plagued by fits, she had been sent by Abigail to collect herbs but came back empty-handed. She came into the house and promptly fell on the floor, crying, screaming, and contorting. And she stayed that way for hours. One thing that is of an interesting note is that this is not the first time that the Westcotts had dealt with something like this. Their daughter Joanna had been tormented by fits when she was younger. For weeks, she had been having fits in the night, screaming that she was being tormented by someone entering her room during the night and seeing creatures that would hide, but there was never anything there for anyone else to see. This went on for weeks to the point where Joanna would not go to bed in their home, and the Westcotts would end up taking her to a neighbor's where she would calm down and finally get some sleep. Unsure of what to do, they eventually sent her to stay with a friend who lived in another town, and she stayed there for a few months until the night terrors stopped and Joanna was finally able to come home. What was not entirely clear from my research was whether Kate had been living with the Westcotts during that time, but she likely would have heard about the events from either the Westcotts themselves or from someone within the town. Regardless, the Westcotts had been concerned at the time that Joanna was undergoing all of these fits because she was potentially bewitched. And we'll get back to that in just a little bit here. Even though Connecticut and Massachusetts were not close, it was also likely that Kate would have heard about the witch trials going on in Salem. What was clear was that the colonists in Connecticut took a little bit of a different approach with Kate than the people of Salem. First, the Westcotts reached out to a midwife named Goodwife Sarah Bates. Goody Bates didn't have any formalized training as a physician, but she had been tending to the townspeople for many years, and she'd learned a lot through observations and treating various ailments. While Goody Bates knew that sometimes even experienced doctors would conclude that someone was bewitched, she thought to try to rule out more of a medical or natural ailment first. So the first day she examined Kate, she advised the Westcotts to try burning feathers under Kate's nose, which was a common treatment for fainting fits. The next morning, Daniel Westcott would fetch Goody Bates and tell her that while the feathers had initially seemed to help, Kate was now in a stupor and was lying senseless and speechless. So Goody Bates again went to the Westcotts' home, and she found Kate as he had described. Abigail Westcott demanded that Kate be bled. Goody Bates was hesitant, but she ended up agreeing after Abigail continued to insist that this be done. So as Goody Bates went to start the bloodletting with Kate's foot, Kate immediately freaked out, breaking out of her stupor, breaking away from them, and yelling that she would not be blooded. And when they asked her why, she said that she was afraid that it would hurt. They reassured her, and she did allow for them to blood her, but Sarah Bates was suspicious at this point. After Kate had been blooded for a little while, the fits started again, and Kate was laying again and screaming, and it was at this point that Abigail started to tell everyone that Kate was bewitched. Things started to escalate from there. Kate started to tell people that during her fits she saw cats, and the cats would talk to her, and they would tell her that they were going to kill her. Daniel Westcott reached out to Stamford's minister, John Bishop, who had studied at Oxford University in 1632. He had been in one of the first waves of Puritan settlers to New England, having served as Stamford's minister for 50 years, so he was a really trusted individual in the community. After examining Kate, John Bishop was convinced that she was bewitched, which was enough to convince Daniel Westcott. The neighbors, however, were not so easy to sway. As time continued to go on, Kate would start to see women with the cats, but the description she would give of them was initially hazy. Daniel Westcott decided the best course of action was to start to have the neighbors come to the house so they could see Kate's fits and help watch over her, because honestly, he and Abigail were getting tired. They had to watch Kate all the time to make sure she wasn't injuring herself. So this would ensure that both he and Abigail were able to get a break, but it would also help validate his idea that Kate was bewitched. Some of the neighbors would end up reporting that they were seeing supernatural occurrences like balls of light when Kate was in the midst of a fit. Other neighbors were definitely convinced she was faking it. Kate would eventually name the first witch that she said was afflicting her as being Goodwife Elizabeth Cary, a woman in her early 60s who lived in Stamford that many people in town had already suspected of being a witch. Like Philip and Mary English, however, the Westcotts had a past issue with Goody Cary and had gotten into quite the argument with her, actually, about a decade prior over the weight of some flax that she had sold them. And flax was really important. It was used to make a lot of other goods. So there had been an ongoing grudge between the Westcotts and Goody Cary ever since, especially between Abigail and Goody, to the point that once when Abigail Westcott walked by Goody Cary's house, Goody Cary threw stones at her. Goody Cary would never stop throwing insults Abigail Westcott's way when she saw her. In fact, the Westcotts actually believed that it had been Goody Cary who had been behind Joanna's bewitching, because it was not long after their argument that she began to have her fits. A short time after naming Goody Clausen, Kate saw a second specter that she described as a short and lame old woman with a hunched back. While Kate never named this specter herself, the Westcotts decided that it had to have been the only woman in town that matched the description she gave. And they named this witch as Goodwife Miller, who they never quarreled with, but they were convinced it was her. Several of the neighbors would later report that when they were watching over Kate, they also heard her name Goody Miller, though sometimes she would call her Goody Crump or Goody Hipshod. Two neighbors, Abraham Finch and David Selleck, would report that during one of her fits, Kate cried out, quote, "Goody Miller, hold up your arm higher that the black dog may suck you better. Now I'm sure you are a witch, for you've got a long teat under your arm," end quote. This sealed Goody Miller's fate as being a witch. Not long after this, Kate would report seeing cats again, and during one fit, one of the cats turned into a woman. She would describe to Abigail Westcott that the woman was tall and had pretty thick lips. And that was really all the information that Kate could provide about the woman, other than she wore woolen homespun cloth of the best quality. Kate then appeared to go into one of her stupors at this point, and Abigail said to the neighbor that was with her that she knew of a woman named Mercy Holbridge, who had previously been suspected of witchcraft and had thick lips. Now, Abigail was convinced that Kate, being in a stupor, could not hear her. I really question that, but Kate, right after Abigail said this to the neighbor, startled awake and said she could see the woman again, and Kate began to question the specter about her name. At first, she announced that it was Mercy Woodbridge, but then she stopped and said, "Oh, I misheard her. It's actually Mercy Holbridge, and that she lived in Compo." Compo was a village just outside of Fairfield. Mercy did live there, and she had married, and now her name was Mercy Disborough. On May 27th, 1692, Daniel Westcott would file a formal complaint on behalf of Catherine Branch, accusing Goody Miller, Goody Clausen, and Goody Disborough of witchcraft. The following day, Goody Clausen and Goody Disborough would appear in court and were questioned. Both professed their innocence. Kate was, of course, in the courtroom when they were being questioned, and she had one of her fits. And due to this, the magistrates placed both women under arrest. Goody Disborough would be sent to the county jail in Fairfield. Goody Clausen was put under house arrest for a couple of weeks, before eventually being sent to Fairfield County Jail as well. And this was because Kate kept bringing up that Goody Clausen was horribly tormenting her in the night. Goody Miller would flee to New York once she became aware that she had been named by Kate as one of the witches. She actually had two brothers who lived in Bedford, New York, which was part of Westchester County at the time. One of them was named Abram Ambler. He was a magistrate, and the other one was Joseph Thiel, who was Bedford's chief military officer and a justice of the peace. So they were high up in Bedford society. Bedford was about 10 miles from Stamford, and it had actually been part of Connecticut's jurisdiction until 1683, when the boundary agreement switched Bedford to being under New York's jurisdiction. So now Connecticut had no jurisdiction over what would happen to Goody Miller. Daniel Westcott, unhappy with this, did visit Bedford and tried to get the magistrates to send Goody Miller back to Stamford for interrogation, but her brother flat out refused, saying that he knew what would happen if she returned to Connecticut. This is where the politics comes into play. Another Bedford magistrate, Judge John Pell, told Daniel Westcott that he would arrange for Goody Miller to return to Connecticut, but Goody Miller's brother intervened. He told Daniel, hell no. Judge John Pell then told Daniel Westcott that he would discuss the matter with New York's Attorney General, James Graham. James Graham had resumed his post as Attorney General the year prior in May of 1691. He had left the post prior and was fighting the battles that would lead to the overthrowing of the Dominion of New England. He had actually been held captive by revolutionaries, forced to share a very small cell with another man, and the cell would end up flooding when it rained. It had no heat. It was terrible conditions. He was not a fan of Massachusetts or of Connecticut because both colonies had declined to get involved in the conflict. So he refused to send Goody Miller back to Connecticut. The governor of New York at the time, Benjamin Fletcher, was also no fan of either Massachusetts or Connecticut. Nathaniel Cary, who we talked about a while ago, would describe Benjamin Fletcher as being very courteous to them. He had actually refused to send them back to Massachusetts when they were facing prosecution. It's very likely that the reason New York did not get involved in the witchcraft hysteria that was plaguing the neighboring colonies was due to everything going on with the King William's War. They were aware of what was going on in Massachusetts and Connecticut, but their northern colony of Schenectady had been destroyed recently by French-Canadian raiders. They were very concerned that Albany was going to be the next colony to fall, and were doing everything in their power to maintain their borders. They had reached out to both Massachusetts and Connecticut, who refused to send aid. Benjamin Fletcher was also a dirty politician. He would actually be found to be conspiring and gaining bribes from pirates in New York, which is a whole nother story that I'm going to have to look into further and bring another day. But I found that to be an interesting little sidebar when I was doing this research. Eventually, the witchcraft hysteria would calm down for Massachusetts and Connecticut. So what happened to our refugees? Interestingly, there is no record of what happened to Goody Miller. We have no idea how long she stayed in New York or if she ever stood trial. The Attorney General, John Graham, had responded back to Connecticut that he was most definitely not sending Goody Miller back to Connecticut with the Puritans who had imprisoned him. So that was a big fuck you. In 1695, the towns of Bedford and Rye would end up being overtaken by militia and ended up back under the jurisdiction of Connecticut. But there's no record even then if she was there, if she ever stood trial, or if she was acquitted. She just disappeared. At the end of June 1692, Kate Branch would end up stating that she saw 4 more specters. One was of a woman from New York named Mary Glover. Another woman was from Boston that Kate said was named Goody Abbison. And finally, a girl and her mother that Kate said were from Stamford, but she didn't know their names. She would also claim that Goody Miller was relentlessly tormenting her. There was a Mary Glover that had been accused of witchcraft back in 1688. But she lived in Boston, and she was actually hung the same year she was accused, which led to some continued suspicion that maybe someone was feeding Kate information. There was talk around town about that because Daniel Westcott had boasted to some of the neighbors that he could control Kate's convulsions, and she would do it on his command. They were also suspicious that maybe the Westcotts were influencing who she accused. Goody Clausen and Goody Disborough of Connecticut would end up standing trial. There was a lot of debate for both, with the jury having a hard time figuring out whether or not to find them guilty. Goody Clausen would end up being found innocent. Goody Disborough, however, was found guilty, but she ended up later being acquitted. And likely the only reason that she was found guilty was there was a group of women that inspected both women looking for what's called a witch's mark. And Goody Disborough was said to have some unnatural anatomy down there that the women brought forward. Now, everyone's anatomy is a little bit different. I'm not sure what they saw. That didn't really go into much detail. There would be some debate. She would be looked at again with a group of some of the same women, some of different women, and there was some debate on whether her anatomy was natural versus not natural. She was never inspected by a physician, however, and the magistrate would actually suggest that she be inspected by a physician, but that never happened. So likely she was found guilty because of this potential for not normal anatomy being seen as a witch's mark, but again, the jury never saw it and it was a question for debate. Nathanial and Elizabeth Cary, who had fled to New York, would eventually end up returning to Charlestown after the witch frenzy had come to an end. Elizabeth would live to the age of 72, passing away in August of 1722. Nathaniel would live another 8 years, dying in Charlestown in July of 1730. They likely would not have had as long a life had they remained in Salem and not been harbored and kept safe in New York. Philip and Mary English would return to Salem in 1693 to find that much of their property had been taken by Sheriff Corwin. In 1694, shortly after giving birth to a son, Mary died of consumption. Philip resumed working in the shipping business and promptly started trying to retrieve his property, which he finally did get a settlement of 532 pounds in 1711. It's rumored that when Sheriff Corwin died of a heart attack, Philip English took revenge by stealing his body from the family cellar in order to gain more of his property back from the family, but it's unclear if this rumor is in fact true. He would end up dying in 1736. And with that is our coverage of New York's role in the Salem and Connecticut witchcraft hysteria. Now, I know it was very heavily not taking place in New York, but again, I just found it really interesting that with everything going on and the rising political climate, that New York did not get involved in the witchcraft hysteria. I did find some research that I want to delve into regarding different time periods because the witchcraft hysteria was kind of pocketed here. And I feel like the Salem Witch Trials is very heavily publicized, but there were definitely other time periods where witchcraft concerns and allegations and accusation and witchcraft trials happened, and some of those were in New York. So I want to kind of look further into that and maybe bring it back at another time and focus on another time period. If you're enjoying the show, please make sure you are following us on your platform of choice to be sure that you are one of the first to get to listen to the new episodes when they drop. I'm going to continue. The episode drops on Sunday for now. It seems to be working out fairly nicely. I've got some good episodes, I hope, lined up for the next couple of weeks. So next week I am looking at more of a true crime type episode. So stay tuned for that. I hope you keep listening, and I hope you stay curious.